Getting countries to agree on anything is difficult. They fight over borders, land, resources, and influence, but somehow Antarctica became the one continent they agreed to protect together. Why? Its official discovery came in 1820, only 4 years after the year without a summer, when several expeditions reached Antarctic waters. But maps drawn centuries earlier seem, at least to some researchers, to suggest that the southern continent was already known. And if Tartaria was deliberately erased from history, the destruction of ancient libraries suddenly becomes much harder to overlook. What if the last surviving piece of that civilization was never erased? What if it was frozen, buried beneath the ice, and eventually given a new name, Antarctica? Chapter 1. The Catastrophe and the Forgotten World. We're not going to talk about monsters or aliens, but something far simpler. One number. 1820. That is the year usually given for the first confirmed sightings of Antarctica. First officially cited, first recorded. First documented. The wording changes slightly depending on where we look, but the date rarely does. For years, there was little reason to question it. It sat quietly in textbooks and historical timelines, one of those facts we learned, remembered, and moved past. Then we began paying closer attention to what was happening around that same period. And 1820 suddenly stopped feeling like an isolated date. The previous chapter took us back to 1816, remembered as the year without a summer. Mount Tambora had erupted the year before, throwing enormous quantities of material into the atmosphere. Temperatures dropped. Harvests failed. Livestock died. Snow appeared during months that should have been warm. Strange sunsets were reported across distant regions, and famine spread through parts of Europe and North America. The accepted explanation points mainly toward Tambora, and volcanic activity certainly played a major role. But the wider picture leaves us with questions worth examining. The disruption stretched across enormous distances, while the years surrounding it brought migration, economic distress, political upheaval, and broken communities. In the last chapter, we explored the controversial possibility that this period may have involved forces or events beyond the conventional explanation, a much larger catastrophe that later became tied, in alternative history circles, to ideas of a forgotten civilization sometimes called Tartaria. That theory remains disputed, but one detail keeps pulling us back. Only a few years after 1816, the historical record gives us another important date. 1820. Antarctica enters the modern record. And once those two dates are placed beside each other, the story becomes much harder to ignore. Chapter 2. Antarctica, 1820, and the maps that shouldn't exist 4 years separate 1816 from 1820. That small gap matters, especially after everything we have already covered. The world had barely emerged from the year without a summer, harvests had collapsed, abnormal cold had reached far beyond Indonesia, and societies were still dealing with the damage. Then, in 1820, Antarctica suddenly enters the official story. Stranger still, its first confirmed sightings are associated with British, Russian, and American voyages operating in Antarctic waters during roughly the same period. There is nothing inherently impossible about that. Exploration was competitive. Sailors followed promising routes, and separate expeditions sometimes reached the same places. But the timing deserves more attention than it usually receives. After thousands of years of seafaring, from Phoenician and Greek sailors to Chinese, Arab, European, and Polynesian navigators, we are asked to accept that this enormous southern continent remained outside confirmed human knowledge until only 4 years after one of the strangest climate disasters of the 19th century. That question becomes even harder to leave alone when older maps enter the conversation. The famous Piri Reis map of 1513, compiled by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis from many earlier charts, contains a southern coastline that has fueled arguments for decades. Supporters of the Antarctica theory believe part of it resembles the continent beneath its ice, while most historians identify the disputed coastline as a distorted continuation of South America. The important part for us is not pretending that disagreement has been settled in favor of the mystery. It has not. What matters is that Piri Reis openly worked from sources older than his own lifetime, leaving us with a fascinating question about how far some of that geographic knowledge may have reached. Then comes Orance Fine's 1531 world map, often pulled into the same debate because its great southern landmass carries mountains, rivers, and a coastline that can look convincing to modern eyes. Mainstream cartography gives us a reasonable explanation. Renaissance mapmakers commonly believed a vast southern continent had to exist, partly because ancient geographic ideas imagined land in the south balancing the known continents of the north. Rivers and mountains could therefore represent speculative geography rather than forgotten surveying. That explanation deserves to remain on the table. Claims that Fine mapped Antarctica accurately beneath the ice, or that Piri Reis somehow preserved a precise ice-free Antarctic coastline, later confirmed by modern technology, go much further than the surviving evidence can securely support. Still, something about the sequence keeps bothering us. These maps existed centuries before the accepted discovery date. Europeans were already drawing enormous southern lands long before Bellingshausen, Bransfield, and Palmer entered Antarctic history. Whether those earlier coastlines represent Antarctica, distorted geography, inherited information, or educated guesswork changes the answer enormously. But it does not erase the question. And this brings us back to 1816. Earlier, we considered the possibility speculative, but worth testing rather than quietly turning into fact that the climate disaster surrounding that year marked something larger than Tambora alone. Suppose we change the question slightly. Instead of asking whether 1816 merely ended something, we ask whether the upheaval also opened the door to something that followed. Could atmospheric disruption have affected polar conditions in ways that later observers misunderstood? Could older geographic traditions preserve memories of southern lands whose meaning had already been lost? There is no solid evidence that Antarctica suddenly froze in 1816. Modern ice core research places its great ice sheets vastly earlier, so we should not force the evidence where it refuses to go. But the historical timing still gives us something worth following. 1816. Great atmospheric disruption. 1820. Antarctica enters the confirmed modern record. And centuries before either date, so many respected mapmakers were already placing a mysterious continent at the bottom of the world. Chapter 3. Military expeditions and the Antarctic Treaty. Those old maps leave us with an uncomfortable loose end. But the story becomes stranger when governments begin treating Antarctica as something worth enormous effort. By 1946, the Second World War had barely ended when the United States Navy organized Operation High Jump, sending thousands of personnel, ships, aircraft, and Rear Admiral Richard Byrd toward the southern continent. Officially, the mission involved training, establishing the Little America 4 base, testing equipment in extreme conditions, and expanding geographic knowledge. Nothing about those goals is unbelievable. What catches our attention is the scale. Antarctica was supposedly an empty frozen wilderness of little immediate value, yet one of the world's strongest militaries considered it important enough for an operation far larger than the casual phrase polar expedition suggests. Germany had already shown serious interest years earlier. The 1938-39 German Antarctic expedition aboard the Schwabenland photographed and surveyed a vast section of Queen Maud Land, later linked with the name Neuschwabenland. Aircraft flew over enormous stretches of territory and dropped markers bearing German symbols as part of Germany's territorial ambitions. Stories later grew around secret bases, submarines, lost technology, and mysterious discoveries. although much of that material has never been supported by reliable documentation. German U-boats surrendering months after the European war ended helped those legends spread even further, but evidence connecting them to an Antarctic refuge remains extremely weak. That distinction matters because the genuine history is curious enough without borrowing certainty from rumors. Still, the attention given to the continent did not disappear with Germany's defeat. Several countries expanded their Antarctic activity during the following years, and by 1959, something remarkable happened. 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty, including Cold War rivals that could barely agree on the shape of tomorrow, much less the management of an entire continent. The agreement reserved Antarctica for peaceful purposes, protected scientific cooperation, and prohibited measures of a military nature such as weapons testing. Later agreements added far stronger environmental protections and restrictions on mineral resource activity. That sounds reasonable, and much of it genuinely is. Yet Antarctica remains unlike anywhere else we know. Ordinary travelers can visit parts of it. Tour ships arrive every season, private expeditions happen, and adventurous people have crossed sections of the interior. So saying nobody is allowed there would be misleading. Freedom of movement, however, is another matter entirely. Reaching the deep interior requires extraordinary money, aircraft, fuel caches, specialist equipment, environmental planning, permits, or authorization depending on nationality and activity, and the ability to survive where a minor mistake can become fatal within hours. There are no ordinary highways leading south, no convenient towns where supplies can be replaced, and no easy rescue once something goes wrong. Maybe geography alone explains that reality. But the political arrangement still deserves attention. Humanity spent much of the 20th century fighting over territory, resources, ideology, oceans, borders, and influence. Against that background, Antarctica became a rare place where rival governments managed to build a lasting framework around peaceful scientific use. That does not prove anyone was concealing something beneath the ice. It does, however, make the continent politically exceptional as well as geographically exceptional. And perhaps that is where the better question begins. Instead of asking why Antarctica is completely forbidden because it isn't, we should ask why this particular continent became subject to such unusual international management, why military-scale expeditions preceded that arrangement, and why its interior remains extraordinarily difficult for an ordinary person to investigate independently. Those questions do not give us a secret base, a forgotten civilization, or proof of an ancient world. They give us something much more useful, a good reason to keep looking. Chapter 4. The Old World Connection Beneath the Ice that brings us to architecture. Because this is where Antarctica begins to touch a much larger question we have been following throughout this series. We have looked at grand buildings appearing remarkably early in developing cities, buried lower floors, windows disappearing beneath present street levels, enormous civic works, elaborate drainage systems, and monumental structures whose popular alternative history explanations often challenge conventional construction timelines. Similar claims appear across Europe, Russia, North and South America, which is why the Old World argument has attracted such a devoted following. Historians offer explanations for many individual examples, changing street grades, basement construction, rebuilding, rapid industrial growth, surviving municipal records, and some cases are far less mysterious once those records are examined. Others continue to provoke arguments because photographs, dates, and surviving paperwork leave room for questions. Taken together, they have encouraged the idea that parts of the 19th century world may have inherited far more than we normally assume. Antarctica takes that suspicion somewhere entirely different. We know there is an extraordinary landscape beneath its ice. Mountain chains, valleys, ancient river-cut terrain, enormous basins, and lakes sealed beneath kilometers of frozen surface. Radar surveys continue revealing details that earlier generations could never have seen. What we cannot honestly say is that 16th century cartographers accurately mapped an ice-free Antarctica, because the famous Piri Reis and Orance Fine interpretations remain heavily disputed. Nor does current evidence place an ice-free, habitable Antarctic continent within recent human history. Its major ice sheets are vastly older, but that does not make what lies underneath any less fascinating. Consider how strange our position actually is. We live in an age when satellites circle the planet continuously. Aircraft carry sophisticated radar, and researchers can reconstruct landscapes buried beneath immense thicknesses of ice. Yet Antarctica still contains enormous areas whose bedrock is known at far poorer resolution than ordinary landscapes elsewhere on Earth. Projects such as Bed Machine and decades of airborne surveys have improved that picture dramatically, so calling the interior simply unmapped would be unfair. The frustrating truth is subtler. We possess a broad picture while many finer details remain unresolved. And those missing details naturally invite uncomfortable questions. Claims of pyramids in the Ellsworth Mountains provide a perfect example. Striking photographs show sharp, pyramid-like peaks rising through the snow, but geologists generally identify them as natural mountain formations shaped by erosion rather than artificial monuments. There is presently no accepted archaeological evidence for cities, pyramids, or an old-world civilization beneath Antarctica. But the absence of such evidence cannot tell us every detail of what remains beneath kilometers of ice. Perhaps that is the part worth holding on to. We do not need to pretend every unusual mountain is architecture or every Renaissance map is a satellite image from another age. Doing that would actually weaken the mystery. The real Antarctic landscape is strange enough. An entire continent-sized world exists beneath the surface, containing geography no living person has ever walked across and terrain we are still piecing together remotely. So the question changes. Not what secret city are they hiding beneath Antarctica? Something far more perplexingly difficult to dismiss: how much of that buried world do we actually understand, and how much remains beyond our sight? Chapter 5. What are they protecting in Antarctica? After everything we have followed through these chapters, there is one thought that refuses to leave quietly. We began with 1816, moved through the strange timing of 1820, followed old maps into disputed territory, watched military powers turn their attention south, and finally reached the enormous world buried beneath Antarctic ice. None of those pieces, by themselves, proves the existence of a forgotten civilization. But if we allow the possibility for a moment, not as established history, but as a question, then the story takes on a very different shape. Suppose an earlier society possessed knowledge, engineering, navigation, or infrastructure that later generations inherited without fully understanding where it came from. Suppose some 19th century mysteries represent fragments of that inheritance. Then Antarctica becomes difficult to treat as merely another frozen continent. And one question remains: what, if anything, are we protecting there? Perhaps the answer is completely ordinary. Scientific research needs uncontaminated environments. Antarctica is brutally dangerous, extraordinarily expensive to reach, and vulnerable to human damage. International rules make sense under those conditions. But another possibility keeps the mystery alive, not necessarily that governments are guarding some fantastic secret, but that Antarctica may contain records of Earth's past we have barely begun to uncover. Beneath that ice lie ancient landscapes, sediments, fossils, geological evidence, and environmental history stretching backward through immense periods of time. Every new survey reminds us how much remains inaccessible. That is where speculation becomes tempting. What would happen if unmistakable evidence of an unknown human presence were ever found beneath the ice? Tools, foundations, inscriptions, roads, chambers, anything that could not be explained by geology. Such a discovery would not simply add another archaeological site to a textbook. It would force us to reconsider when people reached the southern world, what they knew, and how much information may have disappeared between civilizations. We have no reliable evidence that such ruins exist today. That matters. But uncertainty also matters, because pretending we already understand every kilometer beneath Antarctica would be equally dishonest. And somehow, after following this entire trail, we arrive back where we started. 1820, 4 digits that looked completely harmless at the beginning. A devastating climate crisis had struck only years earlier. Then several expeditions reached Antarctic waters during the same remarkable period. Later came increasingly ambitious exploration, military involvement, international cooperation, scientific stations, treaties, radar surveys, and an extraordinary effort to understand a continent most human beings will never see beyond photographs. Coincidence may explain parts of that sequence. Geography explains others. Politics, technology, and scientific ambition explain even more. Maybe there is no single secret connecting any of it, but there are enough unanswered questions to make closing the book feel premature. So we will leave Antarctica where it has remained throughout this story, beneath miles of ice, partly understood, endlessly argued over, and holding far more history than we have yet managed to read. If this series has left you with a theory of your own, share it below. The next chapter takes this investigation somewhere we have avoided until now, and this time we may find ourselves questioning much more than a date. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.